The amber light of sunset streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sinclair Tower's penthouse ballroom, where crystal flutes clinked and the city's elite gathered under the pretense of charity. Elijah Sinclair, founder and CEO of Sinclair Innovations, stood alone at the edge of the crowd, watching as the gathering he'd orchestrated unfolded exactly as planned. In 3 hours, he would secure the merger that would cement his legacy, never suspecting that the exhausted young mother about to enter his world would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 42, Elijah commanded the room without speaking a word. His tailored midnight blue suit spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, and the subtle grey at his temples gave him an air of distinguished authority that the technology industry respected. The annual Sinclair Foundation Gala had become the most coveted invitation in Westlake City, a chance for the wealthy to be seen giving back while securing the connections that would make them wealthier still. "Another triumph, Eli," said Vanessa Chen, gliding to his side with practiced elegance. As Sinclair Innovations' chief marketing officer and Elijah's ex-wife, she maintained the polished professionalism that had outlasted their marriage. The mayor just confirmed the zoning approval for the Innovation District. The board is ecstatic. Elijah nodded, his expression revealing nothing as he surveyed the room. "And Gregory Harmon? Arrived 10 minutes ago. He's by the bar, probably, on his second scotch, nervous about the merger, I suspect." Vanessa's smile was razor-sharp. "I've arranged for you two to have a moment alone on the terrace at 9. By 9:15, Harmon Tech will be ours. Perfect." Elijah checked his watch, a vintage timepiece that had belonged to his grandfather, the only possession he'd kept from his life before success. 2 hours until the meeting that would consolidate Sinclair's control over the quantum computing market. Nothing could derail his plans tonight, until something did. A commotion near the entrance drew his attention. Marcus, head of security, was blocking someone from entering, not with force, but with the firm insistence of a man who rarely needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Elijah frowned. The guest list had been meticulously vetted. No one should be attempting to enter without an invitation. "Handle it," he told Vanessa, turning back to the room. But something in the desperate tone of the voice arguing with Marcus made him pause. "Sir, please. I'm not trying to crash your party. I just need to sit down for a moment. My baby hasn't slept all day, and we've been walking for hours. Just 10 minutes, that's all I'm asking." The voice belonged to a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, clutching a fussing infant to her chest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and though her clothes were clean, they showed signs of wear. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. "Ma'am, I understand, but this is a private event," Marcus was saying, his voice low but firm. "I can call you a taxi." "I don't have money for a taxi," she interrupted, a flash of frustration breaking through her composure. "We were evicted this morning. I've been trying to reach the shelter all day, but they're full. I just need somewhere to sit while I figure out what to do next." Elijah found himself moving toward the entrance before he'd made a conscious decision to intervene. Vanessa caught his arm. "Eli, don't. Let security handle it. Harmon is watching." He gently removed her hand. "It'll only take a moment." As he approached, the young woman looked up and their eyes met. Hers were a deep, rich brown, framed by dark lashes, exhaustion evident but with a spark of determination that caught him off guard. The baby in her arms, perhaps 6 or 7 months old, had stopped fussing and was watching Elijah with solemn curiosity. "What seems to be the problem?" Elijah asked, his voice measured and calm. Marcus straightened. "Mr. Sinclair, I was just explaining to this young woman that the gala is invitation only. I heard, Elijah interrupted, studying the woman more carefully. There was something familiar about her face. You were evicted today? She nodded, adjusting the baby on her hip. From Riverside Apartments. I'm Sarah Reeves, and this is Emma. The baby blinked at the sound of her name, her eyes heavy with the need for sleep. I'm sorry to intrude. We've been walking all day trying to find somewhere to go. Emma's exhausted, and I saw the lights and thought maybe there'd be a quiet corner where she could rest for a few minutes. Riverside Apartments, the name registered immediately. Sinclair Innovations had acquired the property 6 months ago as part of the land package for their new innovation district. A massive urban renewal project that was set to transform the struggling east side of Westlake into a technology hub. The tenants had been given notice to vacate, with relocation assistance provided. At least, that was what Elijah had been told. You didn't receive relocation assistance? He asked, his tone sharpening slightly. Sarah shook her head. They said I didn't qualify because I moved in after the initial notices went out. My previous place burned down 3 months ago, and Riverside was all I could afford on such short notice. The manager said it would be fine, that the building wouldn't be demolished for at least a year. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge of bitterness to it. This morning, they changed the locks while I was taking Emma to her doctor's appointment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elijah felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't how his company operated, or at least it wasn't how he believed they operated. He turned to Marcus. Ms. Reeves and her daughter are my guests, he said with a finality that brooked no argument. Please find them a quiet room where they can rest. Marcus hesitated only a moment before nodding. Yes, sir. This way, Ms. Reeves. As they turned to go, Elijah caught sight of Vanessa watching from across the room, her expression a mixture of disbelief and calculation. Beside her stood Gregory Harmon, CEO of Harmon Tech, and the man whose company Elijah planned to acquire. In less than 2 hours, Harmon's eyebrows were raised in obvious curiosity. The merger, the zoning approval. The careful choreography of the evening suddenly seemed less important than the exhausted young woman and her child being led away by his security chief. Mr. Sinclair, Sarah said, pausing. Thank you. We won't be any trouble, I promise. It's no trouble, he replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. Everything about her presence here was trouble. For his carefully managed image, for the evening's agenda, for the narrative he'd constructed about the kind of company he ran. Vanessa appeared at his side the moment Sarah was out of earshot. What are you doing? She hissed. That woman could be anyone. She could be press, or an activist, or... She's a former tenant of one of our properties. Elijah cut her off. A property that apparently evicted a single mother without proper notice or assistance. The relocation program had guidelines, Eli. Not everyone qualified. Vanessa's tone was placating but dismissive. The development team handled all of that. You can't be expected to know every detail of every acquisition. Maybe I should, he replied, watching as Marcus led Sarah and Emma down a hallway toward the private offices. Find Daniel. I want to know exactly what happened at Riverside today. Daniel Reed was Sinclair's Chief Development Officer and the architect of the Innovation District project. He'd assured the board that the acquisition and tenant relocation process would be handled with the utmost care and social responsibility. Daniel's not here yet, Vanessa said. He texted that he was running late. Some issue with the east side, properties that needed his attention. She placed a hand on Elijah's arm. Eli, focus. Harmon is waiting. This merger is everything we've worked for. Elijah nodded, forcing his attention back to the room. She was right. The merger was the priority. Whatever had happened with Riverside Apartments could be addressed tomorrow. He'd make sure Sarah and her baby had a safe place to stay tonight, and then he'd get to the bottom of the eviction issue. But as he turned to rejoin his guests, he caught sight of Harmon in conversation with a journalist from the Westlake Business Journal. The reporter was gesturing subtly toward the hallway where Sarah had disappeared, and Harmon was nodding with a thoughtful expression. The merger was the priority, but it suddenly felt like it might be slipping out of his control. "I need to check on our unexpected guests," Elijah told Vanessa. "Entertain Harmon for me. Tell him I'll join him on the terrace as planned." Before she could protest, he was moving through the crowd, nodding acknowledgments to board members and investors. Without slowing his pace, the hallway led to a suite of executive offices used during events. Marcus had likely taken Sarah to the smallest meeting room, which had comfortable seating and privacy. He found them there, but not as he expected. Sarah was seated on one of the plush sofas, but instead of Marcus standing guard, the security chief was nowhere to be seen, and the baby, Emma, was not in her mother's arms. She was sound asleep on one of the leather armchairs, carefully positioned with cushions to prevent her from rolling off. Sarah looked up as Elijah entered, her expression guarded. "Your security person went to get some water," she explained, as if sensing his question. "Emma finally fell asleep. I was afraid to move her." Elijah crossed to the chair, looking down at the sleeping infant. Her tiny face was relaxed in sleep, dark lashes against round cheeks, one small hand curled into a fist beside her head. Something about her peaceful vulnerability in the midst of such upheaval struck him with unexpected force. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. 7 months next week," Sarah replied, watching him carefully. "Mr. Sinclair, I want to thank you for your kindness, but I don't want to cause problems. If there's a shelter you could recommend, or even a motel that might have weekly rates—" "You were evicted illegally," Elijah interrupted, turning to face her. "If what you've told me is accurate, my company has violated its own policies, not to mention state tenant protection laws." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "With all due respect, sir, I doubt your company's executives consult you on every eviction notice." "They don't," he admitted, "but they follow protocols that I've approved, and what happened to you today doesn't align with those protocols." He sat down across from her, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Emma. "Tell me exactly what happened." Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah recounted her morning with the kind of precise detail that told Elijah she was used to being disbelieved. She'd left her apartment at 8:30 a.m. for Emma's pediatrician appointment, with all the necessary documentation for her upcoming housing assistance application. When she returned at 11:15 a.m., the locks had been changed. The building manager informed her that all tenants had been required to vacate by 8 a.m., and her belongings had been placed in storage, accessible only after paying a fee she couldn't afford. "I had formula for Emma and a few diapers in my bag, but everything else, clothes, birth certificates, my laptop with all my work, it's all locked away," Sarah concluded. "I called the number they gave us for relocation assistance, but they said since I wasn't an original tenant at the time of acquisition, I wasn't eligible for help." Elijah's frown deepened as she spoke. This wasn't just a procedural oversight, it was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the relocation assistance program his company had established. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked, noting her mention of a laptop. "I'm a freelance graphic designer," she replied. "I was between projects when the fire happened at my old place, but I had just landed a new contract last week. Without my computer, though." She trailed off, the implication clear. Marcus returned with a tray containing water, juice, and some small sandwiches from the gala's catering. He set it down silently and withdrew after a questioning glance at Elijah, who nodded his dismissal. "You should eat something," Elijah said to Sarah, who hesitated only briefly before reaching for a sandwich. "Thank you," she said. then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Why are you helping us? Most people in your position would have had security escort us away." It was a fair question, and one Elijah wasn't entirely sure he had an answer to. He glanced again at Emma, still sleeping peacefully on the chair. "Before meeting Sarah's direct gaze, because what happened to you was wrong," he said finally, "and because I'm responsible, even if indirectly." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "So what happens now? We can't stay in your meeting room forever." Elijah checked his watch. 8:40, 20 minutes until his scheduled meeting with Harmon on the terrace, the merger that would cement his company's dominance in quantum computing, the deal he'd been working toward for 3 years. "I need to return to my guests," he said, standing, "but I want you to stay here and rest. After the gala, we'll figure out a solution for tonight, and tomorrow I'll personally ensure your belongings are returned and proper compensation is arranged." Sarah's expression was skeptical. "That's generous, but—" A soft cry interrupted. Emma had woken and was squirming on the chair, her face scrunching up in preparation for louder protests. Sarah immediately moved to pick her up, but before she could reach her daughter, Elijah had instinctively scooped the baby into his arms. He'd meant only to hand Emma to her mother, but as soon as he lifted her, the baby's cries subsided. She blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes, then reached one tiny hand toward his face. Elijah found himself smiling without meaning to. "She likes you," Sarah said, surprise evident in her voice. "She's usually wary of strangers." Elijah began to pass Emma to her mother, but as he did, the baby laid her head against his shoulder and sighed, her small body relaxing against him. The simple trust of it was staggering. "She's exhausted," Sarah explained, watching them with an unreadable expression. "We've been on the move since this morning." Elijah should have handed Emma to Sarah. He should have excused himself and returned to his guests, to Harmon, to the merger that awaited. Instead, he found himself gently swaying, an instinctive movement he didn't even realize he was making until he caught Sarah's surprised look. "I have nieces and nephews," he explained, though that wasn't entirely true. He had one nephew whom he saw perhaps twice a year, and certainly hadn't held since he was Emma's age. There was something else at work here, something about this child, that resonated with him in a way he couldn't articulate. Before either of them could say anything more, the door opened and Vanessa entered, her practiced smile freezing when she saw Elijah holding the baby. "Eli, it's 8:50. Harmon is headed to the terrace." Her eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Elijah, a calculating assessment taking place behind her professional demeanor. "Marcus can take over here." Elijah knew he should hand Emma back to her mother and leave. The merger was waiting. His board was waiting. The future of his company, the company he'd built from nothing, was waiting on the terrace with Gregory Harmon. Instead, he found himself saying, "Sarah, would you mind joining me for a moment? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Vanessa's smile vanished entirely. "Eli, what are you doing?" "Getting answers," he replied, his voice taking on the edge of authority that had helped build his empire. "Daniel Reed should be here by now. Find him and have him meet me on the terrace." Emma stirred against his shoulder, but didn't wake. Her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his suit jacket. The weight of her was almost nothing, and yet somehow the most consequential thing he'd felt in years. Sarah stood, uncertainty written across her features. "Mr. Sinclair, I don't think—" "Please," he said, softening his tone, "I promise it won't take long, and I think you deserve to hear the explanation for what happened today as much as I do." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, and Elijah led the way out of the meeting room, past a stunned Vanessa, and back toward the main ballroom. He was acutely aware of the picture they must present: the billionaire CEO with a baby asleep on his shoulder, accompanied by a young woman who, clearly didn't belong among the glittering elite of his gala. Heads turned as they passed. Conversations paused. The string quartet faltered for a half measure before recovering. Elijah ignored it all, moving with purpose toward the terrace doors at the far end of the ballroom. Gregory Harmon was already there, nursing a tumbler of scotch as he gazed out at the city lights. He turned as Elijah approached, his eyebrows rising at the unusual sight before him. "Sinclair?" he greeted, his voice carefully neutral. "I see you've been occupied with unexpected developments." "Gregory, this is Sarah Reeves," Elijah said, making no move to hand Emma back to her mother. "Ms. Reeves and her daughter were illegally evicted from their apartment today, an apartment in a building owned by Sinclair Innovations." Harmon's expression shifted from polite confusion to interest. "I see, and the baby seems to have taken a liking to you." "Emma," Elijah said, finding himself oddly protective of the child's identity. "Her name is Emma." The terrace doors opened again, and Daniel Reed stepped out, his confident stride faltering when he took in the scene. Reed was 40, ambitious, and had been with the company for 5 years. He'd risen quickly through the ranks, impressing the board with his aggressive acquisition strategies and talent for maximizing property values. "Daniel," Elijah said, his voice deceptively calm. "Ms. Reeves here was evicted from Riverside Apartments this morning, despite the relocation assistance program we established. Can you explain why?" Reed's eyes darted between Elijah, Sarah, and the sleeping Emma, calculation visible behind his professional mask. "Mr. Sinclair, I'd be happy to brief you on the Riverside situation tomorrow. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue." "Now, Daniel," Elijah interrupted. "Ms. Reeves and her baby have been walking the streets all day because of a decision made by someone in our organization. I want to know who made that decision and why." Reed straightened his shoulders, switching tactics. "We accelerated the vacancy timeline for the Riverside property to accommodate the Innovation District groundbreaking schedule. The board approved the compressed timeline last month. The board approved accelerating construction, not violating our tenant protection policies," Elijah corrected, feeling Emma stir against his shoulder. He instinctively adjusted his hold to keep her comfortable. "Ms. Reeves was told she had until the end of the month to relocate." "Ms. Reeves was not an original tenant," Reed explained, with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. "She moved in after the acquisition, despite the property manager's instructions not to accept new tenants. As such, she didn't qualify for the full relocation package." Sarah stepped forward, her exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by indignation. "That's not true. The manager, Mr. Lowell, specifically told me the apartment was available and that the building wouldn't be demolished for at least a year. He took my security deposit and first month's rent in cash." Reed's expression tightened. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken. Our records clearly show—" "Our records," Elijah interrupted, "might not tell the whole story, Daniel. Did you authorize today's lockout personally?" A flicker of unease crossed Reed's face. "I delegated the Riverside transition to the property management team. If there was a miscommunication regarding the timeline—" "It wasn't a miscommunication," Sarah insisted. "Mr. Lowell told us this morning that the schedule had changed and we had to be out by 8. When I explained that I had Emma's doctor appointment and would be back by noon, he said that wasn't his problem." Gregory Harmon had been watching this exchange with increasing interest, his gaze moving between the participants like a spectator at a tennis match. Now he cleared his throat. "Fascinating as this is, Sinclair, I was under the impression we had matters of our own to discuss." He checked his watch pointedly. "Matters with a rather pressing timeline." Elijah felt Emma shift against his shoulder, her small hand moving to grasp the lapel of his jacket. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of not just his evening, but possibly his entire company. Gregory, I apologize for the interruption. Would you mind giving me a few more minutes to resolve this? It appears there's been a serious ethical breach within my organization. Harmon studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Actually, I find this rather illuminating. Please continue. He stepped back, leaning against the terrace railing with his scotch, content to observe. Elijah turned back to Reed, whose confident demeanor had begun to crack around the edges. Daniel, I want straight answers. Did you know that building managers at our acquired properties were accepting cash deposits from new tenants after acquisition? Reed hesitated a fraction too long. I can't speak to the specific practices of individual managers, but you can speak to the accelerated eviction schedule that was implemented without my approval, Elijah pressed. A schedule that apparently involved changing locks while tenants were away from their homes. The Innovation District timeline required. The Innovation District, Elijah cut him off, was never meant to be built on the backs of displaced families. That was made explicitly clear from the beginning. Reed's expression hardened. With all due respect, Mr. Sinclair, your idealism is admirable but impractical. The board understands that sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good. The Innovation District will create thousands of jobs and revitalize an entire section of the city. At what cost, Daniel? Elijah asked quietly, acutely, aware of Emma's weight against him, of Sarah standing beside him, of Harmon watching with shrewd assessment. And who decided that cost was acceptable? The terrace doors opened again, and Vanessa stepped out, followed by Elijah's assistant, Michael, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Eli, the mayor is asking for you, Vanessa said, her smile fixed but her eyes conveying a clear warning. And several board members have expressed concern about your absence. Michael stepped forward, holding out a tablet. Sir, I have some information you requested about the Riverside property, he said, his voice pitched low. You might want to see this right away. Elijah shifted Emma carefully, keeping her supported against his shoulder while taking the tablet with his free hand. The screen displayed an email chain between Reed and someone named Lowell, presumably the building manager Sarah had mentioned. The exchange explicitly outlined a plan to collect deposits from new tenants while knowing the building would be vacated sooner than disclosed, with the deposits to be split between Reed and Lowell. Elijah's expression darkened as he read. When he looked up, Reed was already backing toward the doors. Daniel, Elijah said, his voice deadly quiet, you're fired. Security will escort you from the building immediately. Expect to hear from our legal team in the morning. Reed's face contorted with a mixture of shock and fury. You can't. The board won't. This is absurd. The board, Elijah replied, evenly will receive copies of these emails, along with a full audit of all properties under your management. Now get out. As Reed was led away by security, Elijah turned to Sarah, who had watched the exchange with wide eyes. Miss Reeves, I owe you an apology, he said. What happened to you today represents a fundamental failure of my company's values and my personal oversight. I give you my word that it will be rectified. Sarah nodded slowly, seeming unsure how to respond to this dramatic turn of events. Thank you, she said finally, but we still don't have anywhere to go tonight. Before Elijah could respond, Emma stirred against his shoulder and lifted her head, blinking sleepily at the unfamiliar surroundings. Her small face scrunched in momentary confusion before her eyes found her mother. She reached out her arms, and Sarah stepped forward to take her. But as the transfer was happening, Emma suddenly clutched at Elijah's lapel with surprising strength for such tiny fingers, refusing to let go. A look of pure astonishment crossed Sarah's face. She really does like you, she said softly. I've never seen her take to someone so quickly. Something about the child's trust, her instinctive connection to him, resonated deep within Elijah's chest. He'd built an empire on calculated decisions and strategic planning. But this small hand clutching his jacket, these solemn eyes gazing up at him, this was something his algorithms and business models had never accounted for. Gregory. Harmon chose that moment to step forward, setting his empty glass on a nearby table. "Well, Sinclair, this has been enlightening." His tone was thoughtful rather than irritated. "I believe I understand your company better now than I would have after hours of merger discussions." Elijah looked up, suddenly remembering the purpose of their meeting. "Gregory, I apologize for the interruption." Harmon waved away his apology. "No need. In fact, I think this has been far more valuable." He glanced at Sarah and Emma, then back to Elijah. "You know, I've always had reservations about this merger, worried that our corporate cultures might be incompatible." "And now?" Elijah asked, sensing a shift in the conversation. "Now," Harmon said with a small smile, "I believe I'd like to revisit our discussions from a different angle. Not a merger, but perhaps a partnership, one that includes a substantial joint investment in affordable housing alongside your innovation district." He extended his hand. "Call me tomorrow. I think we have more to discuss than we realized." As Harmon departed, Vanessa stepped closer, her expression a mixture of disbelief and calculation. "Eli, what just happened? The merger might become something better," Elijah replied, watching as Emma finally allowed herself to be transferred to her mother's arms, though she continued to watch him with solemn curiosity. "Vanessa, please have my car brought around, and contact the Westlake. Grand, I want a suite prepared immediately." Vanessa's eyebrows rose. "For Miss Reeves and her child, Eli, there are protocols for situations like this. The PR team can arrange appropriate assistance without you becoming personally involved." "I am already personally involved," Elijah said, quietly, watching as Sarah gently bounced Emma, who was beginning to fuss again. "And I intend to stay involved until this situation is fully resolved." As Vanessa left to make the arrangements, Elijah turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Reeves, I'd like to offer you accommodation at the Westlake Grand while we sort out the return of your belongings and proper compensation. Would that be acceptable?" Sarah studied him, wariness still evident beneath her exhaustion. "Why are you doing all this? You could have just given us money for a motel and washed your hands of the whole thing." It was a fair question, and one Elijah wasn't entirely sure he had an answer to. There was something about Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of injustice, about Emma's innocent trust as she slept against his shoulder, that had cut through years of corporate detachment. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because sometimes we need a reminder of what really matters." Sarah nodded slowly, then surprised him with a small smile. "Well, Emma seems to have voted in your favor. She's usually a better judge of character than I am." Elijah found himself smiling in return, even as he wondered what exactly he was setting in motion. The evening had veered wildly from his carefully orchestrated plan, yet somehow he felt more certain of his course now than he had hours earlier. As they made their way back through the ballroom toward the exit, Elijah was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. The city's elite, who had gathered to witness his triumph in the merger negotiations, were instead watching him escort a young mother and her baby from his gala. Tomorrow, there would be questions to answer, explanations to provide, damage control to manage. The board would demand to know why he'd fired Reed so publicly, why he'd apparently derailed the merger with Harmon Tech, why he'd become personally involved with a displaced tenant. But tonight, as Emma peeked over her mother's shoulder to maintain eye contact with him, Elijah Sinclair found himself contemplating possibilities he'd never before considered. The Innovation District had been conceived as his legacy, a monument to technology and progress that would bear the Sinclair name long after he was gone. Now, looking at Sarah and Emma, he wondered if perhaps legacy might be measured in different ways. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a precipice and feeling, for the first time in years, truly alive. The presidential suite of the Westlake Grand Hotel gleamed with understated luxury, its vast windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Sarah Reeves stood in the center of the living area, Emma balanced on her hip, her expression a mixture of disbelief and wariness as she took in her surroundings. The marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and custom furniture represented more wealth than she had seen in her entire life. "This is excessive," she said finally, turning to face Elijah, who had personally escorted them to the hotel. "We could have stayed in a regular room." "The presidential suite was available," Elijah replied simply, watching as Emma's eyes widened at the glittering chandelier above them. The baby reached toward the light with a soft coo of delight. "And it has a separate bedroom for Emma." "A separate bedroom," Sarah repeated, a hint of a smile breaking through her composed facade. "She's 7 months old, Mr. Sinclair. She's never had her own room, let alone her own wing." Elijah found himself smiling in return. "Please, call me Elijah, and consider it an apology from Sinclair Innovations for what you've endured today." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Thank you for all of this, but I need to be clear about something. We don't need charity. What we need is justice, our belongings returned, compensation for the illegal eviction, and most importantly, accountability to ensure this doesn't happen to others." There was a quiet dignity in her words that struck Elijah deeply. Despite her circumstances, Sarah Reeves was not seeking pity or handouts, but rather the simple dignity of fair treatment. "I understand," he said, "and you have my word that all of those things will happen. First thing tomorrow, I'll send a team to retrieve your belongings and arrange proper compensation." The hotel room phone rang, and Elijah answered it. After a brief conversation, he turned back to Sarah. "The hotel staff is sending up some essentials, toiletries, baby supplies, and a few clothing options for both of you. I took the liberty of having my assistant order them while we were en route." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Your assistant was able to guess Emma's diaper size." "Michael is remarkably efficient," Elijah replied with a slight smile, "and I may have texted him your daughter's approximate age while you were speaking with the hotel manager." A knock at the door heralded the arrival of the promised supplies, which turned out to be not just essentials, but an abundance of items. Several outfits in different sizes for Emma, clothing options for Sarah, a state-of-the-art portable crib, toys, books, and enough baby products to stock a small store. "This is—" Sarah began, surveying the array of bags and boxes being arranged by hotel staff. "Too much?" Elijah asked, suddenly uncertain. He was accustomed to solving problems with resources, but the look on Sarah's face suggested he might have overstepped. She picked up a small stuffed elephant from one of the bags, rubbing its soft fabric between her fingers. "It's very generous," she said carefully, "but as I said, we're not looking for charity." Elijah watched as Emma, still in Sarah's arms, reached for the elephant with obvious interest. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "It's an attempt to right a wrong. Please, take what you need and leave the rest if you prefer." Sarah handed the elephant to Emma, who immediately clutched it to her chest with a delighted gurgle. "She hasn't had a new toy since the fire," Sarah admitted, her voice softening as she watched her daughter's joy. "Thank you for that, at least." After the hotel staff departed, an awkward silence fell between them. Elijah knew he should leave, return to the gala where board members and investors were undoubtedly wondering about his extended absence. Yet something kept him rooted in place, watching as Sarah settled Emma on a plush couch, the baby still fascinated by her new elephant companion. "I should get back," he said finally. "The hotel has my personal number, if you need anything at all during the night, and I'll return in the morning to update you on the retrieval of your belongings." Sarah looked up, her dark eyes measuring him with an intensity that felt like she was seeing past the tailored suit and CEO facade to something underneath he rarely revealed. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked suddenly. "And don't say, 'It's because it's the right thing to do.' Plenty of powerful people know the right thing and choose otherwise every day." The directness of her question caught him off guard. Elijah was accustomed to people accepting his decisions without challenge, deferring to his authority out of respect or self-interest. Sarah Reeves, despite being in a position of vulnerability, showed no such deference. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I needed to be reminded of the distance between knowing what's right and actually doing it." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer. "Good night, Elijah, and thank you." "Good night, Sarah. Emma." He nodded toward the baby, who looked up at the sound of her name, still clutching her elephant. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Elijah felt again that strange connection that had surprised him earlier when she'd fallen asleep against his shoulder. As he left the suite and made his way to the elevator, Elijah pulled out his phone to check the barrage of messages that had accumulated during the past hour. 3 missed calls from Vanessa, 7 text messages from board members, and an email from Gregory Harmon with the subject line, "A New Direction." He pocketed the phone without responding to any of them. Tonight had shifted something fundamental in his worldview, and he needed time to process before re-engaging with the machinery of his corporate life. Instead of returning to the gala, Elijah instructed his driver to take him home. The penthouse apartment that occupied the top 2 floors of a downtown high-rise was the epitome of modern luxury, featured in architectural magazines and admired by visitors. Tonight, as he moved through its perfect spaces, it struck him as sterile and hollow, beautiful but empty of the warmth he'd felt in that brief moment when Emma had fallen asleep against him. Removing his tie, Elijah poured himself a glass of whiskey and moved to the wall of windows that showcased the city spread below. Somewhere out there, in one of his company's properties, were there other families facing what Sarah and Emma had endured today. The thought was deeply unsettling. He picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would give him honest answers. "It's nearly midnight, Eli," said Jacob Sinclair, his voice gruff with interrupted sleep. At 72, Elijah's father had officially retired from Sinclair Innovations 5 years ago, but he remained Elijah's most trusted advisor. "The gala must have run late." "I left early," Elijah replied, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Dad, I need your perspective on something." Jacob listened without interruption as Elijah recounted the evening's events, Sarah and Emma's arrival, the discovery of Reed's corruption, the confrontation on the terrace, and the unexpected moment of connection with the child. When Elijah finished, there was a long silence before his father spoke. "You know," Jacob said finally, "when I started this company 30 years ago, it was never about building an empire. It was about building a better future. Somewhere along the way, those 2 goals seemed to diverge." "What are you saying?" Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm saying that perhaps tonight wasn't an interruption to your plans, but a course correction." Jacob's voice had taken on the thoughtful tone Elijah remembered from childhood discussions around the dinner table. "Tell me more about this young woman and her child." "Sarah is resilient," Elijah said, searching for the right words. Dignified despite her circumstances. And Emma. He paused, finding it difficult to articulate what he'd felt when the baby had fallen asleep against him. Emma is remarkable. Jacob said, and Elijah could hear the smile in his father's voice. And how do you plan to proceed? I'm not sure, Elijah admitted. The immediate steps are clear. Retrieve their belongings, provide proper compensation, address the corruption within the company. But beyond that, Jacob finished for him, you find yourself contemplating possibilities you hadn't considered before. Yes, Elijah acknowledged quietly. Then I suggest you get some sleep, son. Tomorrow promises to be a day of new beginnings. After ending the call, Elijah stood at the window for a long time, the city lights blurring as his mind filled with images from the evening, Sarah's quiet dignity, Emma's solemn gaze, the weight of the baby against his shoulder. Something was shifting within him, a realignment of priorities he hadn't anticipated when the day began. The next morning dawned with a clarity that matched Elijah's resolve. By 7, he was already in his office, orchestrating a series of decisive actions that sent shockwaves through Sinclair Innovations. First, he dispatched a team to retrieve Sarah and Emma's belongings from storage, personally calling the property manager to make it clear that any fees were to be waived and any difficulty would result in immediate termination. Second, he initiated a comprehensive audit of all Sinclair properties, with particular attention to tenant relocation practices and any hint of the corruption that Reed had perpetrated. Third, he called an emergency meeting of his executive team, excluding only Vanessa, whose loyalty to Reed was well known. By 9 o'clock, the boardroom was filled with nervous executives who had undoubtedly heard rumors about Reed's public dismissal the night before. Elijah stood at the head of the table, his expression resolute. Last night, he began without preamble, I discovered that our development division, under Daniel Reed's leadership, has been engaging in practices that violate not just our company policies, but basic ethical standards and possibly the law. He outlined what he had learned about the Riverside apartment situation, watching as expressions of shock, concern, and in some cases guilty knowledge passed across the faces around the table. Effective immediately, I am establishing a tenant advocacy office within Sinclair Innovations, reporting directly to me. This office will oversee all tenant relations in our properties and ensure that our development practices align with our stated values of community investment and ethical business conduct. Michael, his assistant, entered and placed a folder before him. Elijah opened it, scanning the contents quickly before continuing. I'm also announcing a revised plan for the Innovation District. The new design will include affordable housing, units, community spaces and resources for local businesses, alongside our technology campus. This announcement elicited audible murmurs around the table. The Innovation District had been conceived as a cutting-edge technology hub that would attract top talent and corporate partners. The inclusion of affordable housing represented a significant departure from the original vision. Sir, ventured Charlotte Wells, the Chief Operations Officer, while the sentiment is admirable, the financial implications of such a shift have been thoroughly analyzed, Elijah interrupted, sliding documents across the table. These projections demonstrate that a mixed-use development with affordable components can actually increase our long-term ROI while significantly enhancing community relations and corporate reputation. The executives bent over the figures, skepticism gradually giving way to surprised reassessment as they digested the numbers. Furthermore, Elijah continued, I've spoken with Gregory Harmon this morning. Harmon Tech is interested in partnering with us on this revised vision, not through a merger, but through a strategic alliance that would leverage both companies' strengths. This news silenced even the most vocal skeptics. The Harman partnership had been viewed as essential to Sinclair's quantum computing ambitions, and the prospect of securing it without surrendering company control was unexpected. "How did you manage that?" asked James Forrester, head of strategic partnerships. "Harman has been insisting on a full merger for months." "Let's just say that witnessing our company's commitment to ethical practices made an impression," Elijah replied, thinking of Harman's assessment on the terrace. "Sometimes doing the right thing is also good business." As the meeting continued, Elijah found his thoughts drifting to Sarah and Emma. He'd promised to update them this morning about their belongings, but the cascade of necessary actions had delayed his visit to the hotel. He made a mental note to go as soon as the meeting concluded. Just as the executives were filing out, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, her expression a carefully controlled mask of professional concern. "A moment, Eli," she asked, her voice pleasant but with an underlying tension. Elijah nodded, gesturing for her to close the door. Once they were alone, Vanessa's facade cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath. "You're dismantling everything we've built," she said without preamble. "Reed is threatening to sue for wrongful termination. The board is in an uproar, and now I hear you've completely redesigned the innovation district without consulting the marketing division. What's gotten into you?" Elijah regarded her calmly. He and Vanessa had been married for 3 years early in his career, their divorce amicable enough that they'd continued to work together effectively. She was brilliant at her job, but her loyalty had always been to the corporate machine rather than the people it affected. "What's gotten into me," he replied evenly, "is a long overdue reality check. Reed wasn't wrongfully terminated. He was fired for documented corruption. The Innovation District redesign isn't a whim. It's a strategic pivot that's already attracted Harman's interest." "Because of that woman and her baby?" Vanessa asked incredulously. "Eli, you can't reshape a multi-billion-dollar company based on one emotional encounter." "This isn't about emotion," Elijah countered, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "It's about recognizing that our development practices have strayed from our founding principles. My father built this company to improve communities, not displace them." Vanessa's expression softened slightly, shifting from anger to concern. "I understand the shock of discovering Reed's actions, but this response seems disproportionate. We could have handled the situation discreetly, compensated the affected tenants, and moved forward with our established plans." "That approach," Elijah said quietly, "is exactly why we ended up here. Discretion and damage. Control instead of genuine accountability." He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "The company is changing course, Vanessa. I hope you'll be part of that change, but I understand if you choose otherwise." Leaving her to consider his words, Elijah headed to his office to gather his things before visiting the hotel. He found Michael waiting for him, a tablet in hand. "Updates on the Reeves situation, sir," Michael said efficiently. "Their belongings have been retrieved from storage and are being delivered to the hotel as we speak. The compensation package has been prepared according to your specifications, and the legal team has drafted a formal apology and settlement agreement." "Thank you, Michael," Elijah replied, taking the tablet to review the documents. "Has there been any press coverage of last night's events?" "Some, sir. The Westlake Business Journal has a piece about Reed's dismissal, framing it as a dramatic shake-up at Sinclair Innovations. Social media has a few blurry photos of you with Ms. Reeves and her baby at the gala, but nothing substantial yet." Elijah nodded, unsurprised. "Prepare a press statement about our revised vision for the Innovation District. Emphasize the community, investment aspects, and the partnership with Harman Tech. I want to control the narrative before speculation takes over." As he was about to leave, his phone rang with a call from the hotel manager. "Mr. Sinclair," the manager began, his tone carefully professional, "I thought you should know that Ms. Reeves has checked out of the presidential suite." Elijah froze. "When?" "About 30 minutes ago, sir. She left a note for you, which I've had delivered to your office." Sure enough, an envelope had appeared on his desk, addressed simply to Elijah. He thanked the manager and ended the call, staring at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note on hotel stationery. "Elijah, thank you for your generosity last night. Emma and I are grateful for the safe haven and the comfort it provided after a difficult day. However, we cannot in good conscience continue to accept such extravagant accommodation while the situation remains unresolved for other families from Riverside. I've taken only what we immediately needed from the supplies you sent. A change of clothes each and Emma's elephant, which she refuses to relinquish. We've gone to stay with a friend from the Housing Justice Coalition while we sort out our next steps. If you still wish to discuss compensation or the return of our belongings, you can reach me at the number below. With gratitude, Sarah Reeves." Beneath her signature was a phone number and a postscript. "P.S. Emma keeps looking for you. She's quite taken with her elephant man, her first attempt at a nickname, I believe." Elijah read the note twice, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Disappointment that they had left, respect for Sarah's principles, and an unexpected warmth at the thought of Emma looking for him. He immediately dialed the number she'd provided. "Hello?" Sarah's voice answered after 3 rings, the sounds of a busy cafe audible in the background. "Sarah, it's Elijah Sinclair. I just received your note." "Oh." There was a brief pause. "I hope you understand why we couldn't stay." "I do," he replied, surprised to find that he genuinely did. "But I'd still like to meet with you today. Your belongings have been retrieved and are being delivered to my office as we speak, and I have updates on the company's response to the situation that I think you'll want to hear." Another pause, longer this time. "All right," she said finally. "I'm at Riverfront Cafe on Maple Street. Emma and I will be here for another hour or so. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Elijah promised, already heading for the door. The Riverfront Cafe was a world away from the Westlake Grand's presidential suite, a cozy neighborhood establishment with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. It catered to students, young professionals, and families from the surrounding area. As Elijah entered, dressed down in slacks and a button-up shirt without a tie, he spotted Sarah immediately. She sat at a corner table, Emma in a high chair beside her, the stuffed elephant propped on the tray. The baby was methodically picking up Cheerios from the tray and alternating between eating them and offering them to the elephant. Sarah looked up as Elijah approached, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "You found us," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Your directions were excellent," he replied, sitting down. "How are you both this morning?" "Better," Sarah admitted. "Amazing what a night of actual sleep can do, even in the midst of chaos." She studied him for a moment. "You, on the other hand, look like you haven't slept at all." Elijah smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious? I've been somewhat occupied with company matters since dawn." Emma, noticing his arrival, let out a delighted squeal and held out a slightly crushed Cheerio in his direction. Without thinking, Elijah leaned forward and pretended to eat it from her tiny palm, earning a belly laugh from the baby that drew smiles from nearby patrons. "She remembers you," Sarah observed, watching their interaction with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "The feeling is mutual," Elijah replied, surprising himself with the admission. There was something about Emma's unguarded joy that cut through his usual professional reserve. "I brought something for her, actually, for both of you." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet-covered box, which he slid across the table to Sarah. Her eyebrows rose as she picked it up. "This isn't... we barely know each other," she said, attempting to make a joke of what appeared to be a jewelry box. Elijah laughed, a genuine sound that he realized had been rare in recent years. "Nothing like that, I assure you. Please, open it." Sarah did, revealing a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. The pendant was in the shape of an elephant, with tiny sapphires for eyes. "I thought Emma might like a more permanent version of her new friend," Elijah explained. "For when she's older, of course. The chain is sized for an adult now, so perhaps you could keep it for her until then." Sarah touched the pendant lightly, her expression softening. "It's beautiful. But surely you have more important matters to attend to than buying gifts for a baby you just met." "You'd be surprised," Elijah replied, watching as Emma reached for the shiny object with obvious interest. Sometimes the seemingly small things turn out to be the most important. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a waitress who took Elijah's order for coffee with barely concealed curiosity about the well-dressed stranger in their neighborhood cafe. Once they were alone again, Elijah shifted to the business at hand. "Your belongings are being delivered to a secure storage facility, accessible at your convenience. I've also prepared a compensation package that includes 6 months of housing at a location of your choice, funds to replace any damaged items, and an additional amount for the distress caused by the illegal eviction." Sarah's expression remained neutral. "And the other families from Riverside, what about them?" "That's the update I wanted to share with you," Elijah replied, leaning forward slightly. "Sinclair Innovations is establishing a tenant advocacy office to ensure nothing like this happens again. We're also completely redesigning the Innovation District to include affordable housing units, with priority given to displaced Riverside residents." Sarah's careful composure slipped, revealing genuine surprise. "You're serious? This isn't just a PR move?" "Completely serious," Elijah confirmed. "In fact, I'd like to offer you a position as a consultant for the redesign. Your experience with housing advocacy would be invaluable in ensuring we actually meet community needs rather than just appearing to do so." Sarah stared at him, speechless for a moment. Emma took advantage of the lull to offer Elijah another Cheerio, which he accepted with solemn gratitude. "Why would you offer me that role?" Sarah asked finally. "You don't know anything about my qualifications. I know that you're principled, articulate, and deeply knowledgeable about the housing challenges facing this community," Elijah replied. "I know that you left a presidential suite because you couldn't accept comfort while others were still suffering. And I know that your perspective is exactly what my company has been missing." Sarah absently stroked Emma's hair as she considered his words. "It's an interesting proposition," she admitted, "but I'd need to think about it, and there would have to be clear boundaries, given that you're also providing us with compensation." "Of course," Elijah agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless of your decision about the compensation package." As they continued talking, Elijah found himself increasingly drawn into their world. Sarah's thoughtful perspectives on community development, Emma's delighted discovery of each new Cheerio hidden under her elephant. It was so far removed from the boardrooms and galas that had defined his existence for years, yet somehow felt more authentic than anything he'd experienced in a long time. When Emma began to show signs of fatigue, rubbing her eyes and fussing slightly, Sarah gathered their things to leave. "Thank you for coming to find us," she said as they stood to depart. "And for everything else. It's not what I expected when I approached your gala last night." "Life rarely follows our expectations," Elijah replied, helping her collect Emma's scattered toys. "Sometimes that turns out to be a blessing." As they walked toward the door, Emma reached out from her mother's arms, clearly wanting Elijah to hold her. Without hesitation, he took the baby, who immediately laid her head against his shoulder with a contented sigh, exactly as she had the night before. The simple trust of it, the weight of her tiny body against his chest, awakened something in Elijah that he hadn't known was dormant, a capacity for connection that transcended business strategies and corporate achievements. Looking down at Emma's drowsy face, then up at Sarah's cautious but warming expression, Elijah Sinclair realized that the most unexpected development of all might not be the redesigned Innovation District or the Harmon Partnership, but the possibility of a personal transformation he had never anticipated. The following weeks unfolded with a momentum that surprised even Elijah, accustomed as he was to the swift execution of business strategies. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Sarah and Emma would become fixtures in his life, moving from unexpected interruption to essential presence with a natural ease that defied his usual careful planning. Sarah had accepted the consultant position after 3 days of deliberation, setting clear boundaries that Elijah respected without question. She worked 3 days a week from a dedicated office in the Sinclair Tower, bringing a community perspective to the Innovation District redesign that transformed the project from merely inclusive to genuinely revolutionary. The other 2 weekdays, Sarah focused on her freelance graphic design work, rebuilding her client base with the help of a new high-performance laptop that had appeared on her desk with a simple note: Tools of the Trade, ES. She had accepted it with a knowing smile and a single condition: that she be allowed to design the branding for the new tenant advocacy office free of charge. And then there were the weekends. Unplanned, unscheduled times when Elijah found himself gravitating to the modest 2-bedroom apartment Sarah had chosen as their new home. He would arrive with coffee and pastries, claiming a business question that couldn't wait until Monday, though they both knew it was Emma he came to see. Today was one such Saturday. Elijah stood in Sarah's small kitchen, carefully preparing a bottle according to her instructions while she showered, a domestic task he'd never imagined himself performing a month ago. Emma sat in her high chair, watching his every move with solemn attention. The silver elephant pendant, now attached to a stuffed toy for safety, clutched in her tiny fist. Almost ready, Elijah told her, testing the temperature of the formula on his wrist, as he'd seen Sarah do. Your standards are exacting, Ms. Emma, but I believe this batch will meet specifications. Emma responded with a series of babbles that sounded remarkably like a business negotiation, complete with emphatic hand gestures. Elijah found himself laughing, a frequent occurrence in Emma's presence. Your counter-proposal is noted, he said, lifting her from the high chair. But I'm afraid these are the final terms. As he settled into the living room sofa with Emma in his arms, the bottle accepted with serious deliberation before she began drinking, Elijah marveled at how comfortable this had become. This simple act of caring for a child he'd known for barely a month. Sarah emerged from the hallway, hair damp from her shower, dressed casually in jeans and a soft blue sweater. She paused in the doorway, observing them with an expression Elijah couldn't quite decipher. Something between amusement and wonder. You're getting good at that, she commented, crossing the room to join them. 6 weeks ago, did you ever imagine you'd be an expert at formula temperature and burping techniques? 6 weeks ago, Elijah replied, shifting Emma slightly as she continued to drink. I couldn't have imagined any of this. He gestured vaguely to encompass the apartment, the 3 of them, the strange new reality that had emerged from that chance encounter at the gala. Sarah tucked her feet beneath her on the sofa, studying him with the direct gaze that had first caught his attention. Any regrets? It was a loaded question, one that acknowledged the dramatic shifts in both their lives. Elijah had upended his company's direction, alienated longtime allies like Vanessa, who had resigned 2 weeks ago to join a competitor, and fundamentally altered his own carefully constructed routine. Sarah had gone from desperate job seeker to a key consultant on a multi-billion-dollar development, her voice suddenly carrying weight in rooms where she would previously have been invisible. "Not one," Elijah answered honestly, "although the board might have a different opinion." Sarah smiled at that. "From what I hear, the board is surprisingly supportive of Sinclair's new direction, especially since the Harman partnership announcement doubled your stock price." It was true. The strategic alliance with Harman Tech, centered around the reimagined Innovation District, had generated more positive press and investor enthusiasm than the original merger plan ever had. What had begun as an ethical correction had transformed into a business triumph, though Elijah found himself increasingly measuring success by different metrics, like the weight of Emma falling asleep in his arms, or the growing confidence in Sarah's voice when she challenged conventional development wisdom in executive meetings. Emma finished her bottle, and Elijah expertly shifted her to his shoulder for burping, a skill he'd mastered with surprising speed. The baby sighed contentedly, her small hand patting his back in a gesture that never failed to tighten something in his chest. "The Housing Justice Coalition is presenting their final report on community needs today," Sarah said, changing the subject. "They've asked if I'd introduce you at the meeting. Apparently, you've become something of a folk hero since the Riverside situation." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Folk hero seems a stretch. I'm fairly certain half the coalition still views me with deep suspicion." "With good reason," Sarah pointed out, though her tone was light. "But they're coming around. What you've done with the Tenant Advocacy Office is unprecedented, giving actual power to community representatives rather than just symbolic seats at the table." The Tenant Advocacy Office had indeed become something remarkable under Sarah's influence. What Elijah had initially envisioned as a compliance department had evolved into a genuine community partnership, with residents from affected neighborhoods serving as paid consultants with real decision-making authority. It was changing not just how Sinclair Innovations developed properties, but how the entire industry viewed community engagement. "Will you come?" Sarah asked. "The meeting's at 2 at the community center. Eleanor specifically asked for you." Eleanor Diaz was the formidable founder of the Housing Justice Coalition, a retired civil rights attorney who had initially regarded Elijah with open hostility, but had gradually become one of his most valuable advisors on community matters. "I'll be there," he promised, just as his phone chimed with an incoming message. Emma startled at the sound, then settled back against his shoulder with a yawn. Sarah reached for the phone on the coffee table, glancing at the screen. "It's Michael. He says it's urgent." Elijah shifted Emma to a more secure position and took the phone. The message from his assistant was brief but concerning. "Mr. Harman, attempting to reach you. Says partnership terms being reconsidered. Board emergency. Meeting called for 3 p.m. A month ago, such a message would have sent Elijah immediately to his office, cancelling all other commitments without hesitation. Today, he found himself weighing the message against his promise to Sarah, against the warm weight of Emma on his shoulder. "Problem?" Sarah asked, reading his expression. "Potentially," he admitted. "Harman is wavering on the partnership, and the board has called an emergency meeting." Sarah nodded, already standing. "You should go. I'll get Emma ready, and we can meet you at Sinclair Tower before the coalition meeting." Elijah looked up in surprise. "You're coming to the board meeting?" "Not to the meeting itself," Sarah clarified, "but I suspect this has something to do with the affordable housing component of the Innovation District. I've got all the community impact data on my laptop. You might need it to make your case." There it was again, that seamless integration of their previously separate worlds, Sarah's intuitive understanding of what he might face with the board, her immediate readiness to provide support. In just 6 weeks, they had developed a partnership that transcended their professional roles, a synchronicity that felt both natural and extraordinary. "Thank you," Elijah said simply, carefully transferring the now drowsy Emma to her mother's arms. The baby protested briefly before settling against Sarah with a contented sigh. As Elijah gathered his things to leave, Sarah caught his arm. "Eli," she said, using the shortened version of his name that had recently slipped into her vocabulary, "whatever Harmon's concerns are, remember why we're doing this. It's not just about profit margins or stock prices. It's about creating a city where Emma and children like her can thrive, regardless of their parents' income bracket." The simplicity and truth of her statement centered him immediately. Elijah nodded, squeezing her hand briefly before departing. As his car navigated the Saturday traffic towards Sinclair Tower, Elijah found himself reflecting on the transformation of the past 6 weeks. Not just in his business approach, but in himself. The CEO who had orchestrated that charity gala, with calculated precision, viewing philanthropy primarily as a networking opportunity, seemed like a stranger now. That version of Elijah Sinclair would never have spent his Saturday morning preparing formula and burping a baby, would never have prioritized a community coalition meeting over a board crisis. Yet here he was, texting Michael to reschedule the board meeting for 1 p.m. to ensure he could still attend the Housing Justice Coalition presentation at 2. Here he was, mentally preparing arguments not just about profit projections and market share, but about community impact and ethical responsibility. Here he was, a different man. The Sinclair Tower gleamed in the midday sun as Elijah's car pulled into his reserved parking space. Michael was waiting in the lobby, tablet in hand, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. "Sir, Mr. Harmon arrived 20 minutes ago and is waiting in your office. The board members are gathering in the conference room, and Ms. Chen has also requested to attend." "Vanessa?" Elijah asked in surprise. His former CMO and ex-wife had made her departure from Sinclair Innovations quite dramatic, with thinly veiled comments to industry press about the company's misguided new direction. Michael nodded, falling into step beside Elijah as they crossed the lobby toward the executive elevator. "She arrived with Mr. Harmon. I took the liberty of reviewing security footage. They entered the building together." "Interesting," Elijah murmured, mind racing with the implications. Vanessa had connections throughout the industry. If she was attempting to sabotage the Harmon partnership, it would align with her publicly expressed doubts about Sinclair's new community-focused approach. "Also," Michael continued, lowering his voice as they entered the elevator, "Ms. Reeves called. She's on her way with the community impact data and asked me to set up a workspace in the small conference room adjacent to the boardroom." "Thank you, Michael," Elijah said, genuinely grateful for his assistant's foresight. "Please ensure she has everything she needs when she arrives." The elevator whisked them to the executive floor, where the atmosphere of weekend tranquility had been replaced by palpable tension. Board members in hastily assembled business attire were already gathering, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. Elijah bypassed the growing crowd and headed directly to his office, where Gregory Harmon stood at the window, gazing out at the city below. Vanessa was seated in one of the visitor chairs, her posture perfect as always, a slim portfolio on her lap. "Gregory," Elijah greeted, extending his hand, "this is an unexpected development." Harmon turned, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Sinclair, thank you for coming in on short notice." "Of course." "Hello, Vanessa," Elijah added, acknowledging his ex-wife with a nod that she returned coolly. "I'll be direct," Harmon said, moving to take a seat. There are concerns about the financial viability of the innovation district as currently designed. Ms. Chen has presented some compelling analyses that suggest the affordable housing component may be more burden than benefit. Elijah seated himself behind his desk, maintaining a calm exterior despite the surge of disappointment. I see. And these analyses weren't available to your team during the extensive due diligence process we've conducted over the past month? Harmon had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. New information has come to light. I'd be interested to hear this new information, Elijah replied evenly. Particularly since our projections have been verified by 3 independent consulting firms. Vanessa leaned forward, sliding a document across the desk with the smooth confidence that had once made her such an effective CMO. These are the real numbers, Eli. Without the creative accounting your new team has been employing to make the community components appear profitable. Elijah glanced at the document without touching it. My new team, as you put it, includes some of the most respected urban economists in the country. Are you suggesting they've falsified data? I'm suggesting, Vanessa replied carefully, that their methodology privileges long-term community benefits over short-term investor returns. A noble approach, perhaps, but not one that will satisfy shareholders. The intercom on Elijah's desk buzzed, and Michael's voice came through. Sir, the board is assembled, and Ms. Reeves has arrived with the community impact data. Thank you, Michael. Please tell the board we'll join them momentarily. Elijah stood, buttoning his jacket. Gregory, I think this discussion would benefit from all the relevant information, shall we? As they made their way to the boardroom, Elijah spotted Sarah through the glass walls of the adjacent conference room. She was setting up her laptop, Emma secured in a portable infant seat beside her, contentedly playing with her elephant toy. The domestic scene looked strangely out of place against the corporate backdrop, yet somehow perfectly right. Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes through the glass. She must have read something in his expression, because she gave him a small, encouraging nod before returning to her work. The boardroom fell silent as Elijah entered with Harmon and Vanessa. The 12 board members were seated around the massive table, expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. At the far end sat Jacob Sinclair, Elijah's father, whose presence at a weekend emergency meeting was unprecedented since his retirement. Ladies and gentlemen, Elijah began without preamble, Mr. Harmon has raised concerns about the financial viability of our innovation district design, particularly the affordable housing component. Ms. Chen, formerly our Chief Marketing Officer, has provided him with analyses suggesting our projections are overly optimistic. Murmurs spread around the table as Vanessa distributed copies of her report. Elijah continued, Before we proceed, I've asked Sarah Reeves, our community development consultant, to join us with the latest impact data. Michael, would you please show Ms. Reeves in? Vanessa's head snapped up, surprise flashing across her features. The tenant from the gala? Eli, this is a board meeting, not a community forum. Ms. Reeves, Elijah corrected firmly, is a key consultant on the Innovation District project and has expertise directly relevant to this discussion. The door opened and Sarah entered, professional in a simple blazer over her jeans, tablet in hand. If she was intimidated by the roomful of executives, she showed no sign of it. Emma remained in the adjacent room, visible through the glass, supervised by Michael. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Reeves, Elijah said formally, maintaining professional distance despite the morning they'd shared. Mr. Harmon and Ms. Chen have raised concerns about the financial projections for the Innovation District's affordable housing component. Sarah nodded, taking the position Elijah indicated at the table. I've reviewed Ms. Chen's analysis, she said, surprising everyone. At Elijah's questioning look, she added, "Michael showed me the document when I arrived. It's essentially the same argument that was presented and refuted during the initial planning phase." Without waiting for permission, Sarah opened her tablet and projected a series of graphs onto the main screen. These are the actual occupancy and revenue figures from similar mixed-income developments in comparable markets. As you can see, the integrated model consistently outperforms segregated luxury developments in terms of long-term appreciation and stability. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah methodically dismantled Vanessa's analysis, drawing on case studies, economic research, and the preliminary interest data from potential commercial tenants for the Innovation District. Her presentation was clear, concise, and devastating in its precision. Furthermore, she concluded, the community integration components have generated significant goodwill equity, as evidenced by the 47% increase in positive media coverage of Sinclair Innovations over the past month. This translates to reduced marketing costs and enhanced recruitment potential for the tech campus portion of the development. The boardroom was silent when she finished. Gregory Harmon was studying Sarah with newfound respect, while Vanessa's expression had hardened into a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide her frustration. "Thank you, Ms. Reeves," Elijah said into the silence. "That was most illuminating." Jacob Sinclair cleared his throat from the end of the table. "I'd like to ask Ms. Reeves a question, if I may." At Elijah's nod, he continued, "Young lady, what is your background in urban economics? Your analysis is impressively thorough." Sarah met the elder Sinclair's gaze directly. "I have a bachelor's degree in urban planning, Mr. Sinclair, though I never completed my master's due to financial constraints. But more relevantly, I spent 3 years as a research assistant at the Urban Development Institute before transitioning to graphic design work when my department lost funding." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "So you come to this with both academic training and lived experience of housing insecurity. A valuable combination." "If I may," Gregory Harmon interjected, "Ms. Reeves's presentation addresses the economic concerns effectively, but there remains the question of execution risk. Mixed-income developments require different management approaches than luxury properties. Does Sinclair Innovations have the expertise to deliver this vision?" It was a fair question, and one that Elijah had anticipated. "We're assembling a specialized team, drawing from the best in the industry. But more importantly, we're approaching this as a learning organization, acknowledging that we need to evolve our practices to succeed with this model." As the discussion continued, Elijah noticed Sarah glancing periodically toward the adjacent room, where Emma was still contentedly playing under Michael's watchful eye. The baby had become an unexpected presence in Sinclair Tower over the past weeks, accompanying Sarah on her consulting days, charming even the most serious executives with her ready smile and curious eyes. Something about seeing Emma there, a child whose future might be shaped by the decisions being made in this very room, grounded the entire proceeding in reality. This wasn't just about profit margins and stock prices. It was about the kind of city they were creating for the next generation. After nearly an hour of detailed discussion, Gregory Harmon leaned back in his chair, a decision apparently reached. "I'm satisfied with the economic case," he announced. "Harmon Tech remains committed to the partnership as outlined, with one additional condition." "And that is," Elijah prompted, "that Ms. Reeves be appointed to a formal leadership position within the Innovation District project," Harmon said, surprising everyone. "Her expertise is clearly vital to the success of this approach, and I want assurance that she'll remain involved throughout execution, not just planning." Elijah glanced at Sarah, whose expression registered surprise before she composed herself. "That would be a decision for Ms. Reeves to consider," he replied carefully, "but I would certainly support such an arrangement if she's interested." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with the board voting unanimously to proceed with the Innovation District as designed. As the room emptied, Vanessa approached Elijah, her composure intact despite the clear defeat. "You've changed, Eli," she observed, her tone somewhere between accusation and reluctant admiration. "I'm not sure I recognize the man who would risk $1 billion development on community impact metrics." "Perhaps I've simply remembered what this company was founded to do," Elijah replied. "My father didn't build Sinclair Innovations to maximize shareholder value at all costs. He built it to create sustainable prosperity that benefited everyone." Vanessa's gaze shifted to the adjacent room where Sarah was now gathering Emma into her arms, the baby's delighted laughter visible, even through the glass. "Is that what this is really about? Sustainable prosperity? Or is it about them?" It was a perceptive question, one that Elijah had been asking himself with increasing frequency. The transformation in his business approach had begun with that chance encounter at the gala, certainly, but was it driven by ethical awakening or something more personal? "Perhaps it's both," he answered honestly. "Sometimes the personal and the principled align in ways we don't expect." Vanessa studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, decisively. "Well, it seems I've backed the wrong horse in this race. Consider my resignation from Meridian Ventures effective immediately. I'll be submitting an application to your tenant advocacy office next week." "You're serious?" Elijah asked, genuinely startled. "Deadly," she replied with a hint of her old sharpness. "I recognize a winning strategy when I see one, even when it proves me wrong. Besides," she added, glancing again towards Sarah and Emma, "some changes are worth adapting to." Ubu. With that enigmatic comment, she departed, leaving Elijah to contemplate the continued ripple effects of that fateful night 6 weeks ago. Sarah joined him a few minutes later, Emma balanced on her hip, the baby reaching for Elijah the moment she saw him. Without thinking, he took her, and Emma immediately settled against his shoulder in what had become her favorite position. "So," Sarah said, watching them with a smile, "it seems I've been offered a job." "So it seems," Elijah agreed, "though I want to be clear that there's no pressure to accept. Harmon was impressed by your presentation, but you've already taken on more than we initially discussed with the consulting role." Sarah considered this, absently straightening Emma's small cardigan. "It's an interesting proposal. Director of Community Integration for the Innovation District would be a significant step up from freelance graphic design." "You'd be exceptional at it," Elijah said with complete sincerity, "but it would also mean being in the corporate spotlight, which comes with its own challenges." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Like being seen as the charity case who got a job because her baby charmed the CEO. "No one who has worked with you would ever think that," Elijah replied firmly. "Your presentation today proved that beyond doubt." Emma, bored with the adult conversation, had begun playing with Elijah's tie, her small fingers tracing the pattern with focused attention. The simple, trusting gesture tightened something in his chest, a now familiar sensation whenever Emma showed her unquestioning acceptance of him. "We should get going if we're going to make the Housing Justice Coalition meeting," Sarah said, checking her watch. "Eleanor will never forgive us if we're late, emergency board meeting or not." "Actually," Elijah said, making a sudden decision, "I was hoping we might take a detour first. There's something I'd like to show you both." 20 minutes later, their car pulled up to a construction site at the edge of what would soon become the Innovation District. The area was quiet on a Saturday afternoon, the heavy equipment still and silent, waiting for Monday's activity to resume. "What is this place?" Sarah asked as Elijah led them toward a viewing platform that had been erected at one corner of the site. "The future," he replied simply, helping her navigate the temporary stairs while still carrying Emma. Or at least one possible version of it. From the platform, they could see the entire development area spread before them. The old industrial buildings slated for adaptive reuse, the cleared spaces where new construction would soon begin, and beyond them, the city skyline in the new distance. "The Innovation District," Sarah said, recognizing the layout from the plans she'd been consulting on. "Yes," Elijah confirmed, "but more specifically, this section here." He pointed to an area near the center of the site. "This is where the first phase of the mixed-income residential units will be built. And this," he indicated a specific spot, "is where I've reserved a 3-bedroom apartment for you and Emma if you decide to accept the director position." Sarah turned to him in surprise. "You're offering us an apartment in the development?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to live in the community you're helping to create," Elijah clarified, "to see firsthand whether we're delivering on our promises." Emma, fascinated by the expansive view, pointed excitedly at a flock of birds rising from a nearby tree, babbling her commentary in a language only she understood. "What do you think, Emma?" Sarah asked her daughter, smiling at her enthusiasm. "Should we help Mr. Sinclair build a neighborhood where everyone belongs?" Emma's response was to reach out one hand toward the construction site while maintaining her grip on Elijah's shoulder with the other. A gesture that seemed to bridge her past and future with perfect baby logic. "I think that's a yes," Elijah interpreted, surprised by the emotion that tightened his throat as he looked out over the site with Emma in his arms and Sarah beside him. In that moment, standing at the edge of the project that would redefine both his company and the city, Elijah Sinclair realized that his vision had expanded beyond corporate success or even ethical business practices. Somehow, in the 6 weeks since a desperate young mother had interrupted his carefully orchestrated gala, he had begun to imagine a future that included not just professional accomplishment, but personal connection. A life where boardrooms and baby bottles coexisted, where success was measured in more than stock prices and market share. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this new horizon opening before him. And as Emma's small head drooped against his shoulder, her energy finally flagging after the excitement of the day, Elijah found himself hoping that this unexpected path might lead to places he had never dared to dream of before that fateful night. "We should get her home for a proper nap before the coalition meeting," Sarah said softly, noticing Emma's drowsy state. Home. The word resonated with unexpected meaning as Elijah carefully adjusted his hold on the sleeping child. Where exactly was home now? His pristine penthouse felt increasingly empty, while Sarah's modest apartment had begun to feel more welcoming than any space he'd ever owned. "Yes," he agreed, reluctant to disturb Emma, but knowing Sarah was right. "We should." As they made their way back to the car, Emma now fully asleep against his shoulder, Elijah found himself wondering if his father had been right that night on the phone. Perhaps their chance encounter hadn't been an interruption to his plans, but a course correction towards something infinitely more valuable than he had ever pursued before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.